my slides are over there, so anybody who wants to take a look at them, they're mostly just to make sure I stay on track and stay on time for your agenda. But I'm pleased to be here. It's nice to be invited back again and to give you an update of activities of the Delta Watermaster. So in terms of the things I'd like to quickly report on, first of all, the comparative study of different methods for measuring consumptive use in the Delta, which is an important study that we're involved with and that we're grateful for the Commission's support on. And then more quickly than that, I'd like to run through a report that we issued just last Friday on the diversion reduction program, primarily for the southern and central parts of the Delta, that reduced agricultural irrigation diversions during the 2015 growing season to help take some pressure off the water system. Then I want to touch briefly on work that we're doing to deal with salinity hotspots in the South Delta. There are areas down there which have a chronic difficulty meeting the performance objectives in the project's water rights conditions. We're trying to address that with assistance from a lot of people in this room. I also want to touch quickly on the new regulation that is going into effect on a staggered basis, but beginning next January, for measuring all agricultural diversions in the state of California over 10 acre-feet per annum. That's going to have some significant impacts here in the Delta. I want to touch briefly on some enforcement actions that are going on, again, as a result of the drought and curtailment notices that were issued last year, and now with a couple of enforcement actions going forward. And then finally, I want to talk just a little bit about what we're trying to do to consolidate some of the lessons learned from the drought. So first and foremost, with respect to the consumptive use study, this really stands on the shoulder of work that the Commission fostered, a proof of concept study that we have now taken to Delta-wide to develop better methodologies and to compare methodologies for determining consumptive use in the Delta. And it's important to get a better handle on that, primarily so that we have less dissonance in the system about what consumptive use actually is. We ought to be able to agree on what the consumptive use is and then use that to inform policy decisions. So there has been controversy in the past about how and what the quantification of consumptive use is. There are multiple methods that are used for different purposes by different organizations. The purpose of this study is not to figure out which one's best, but to compare them all, because those methods will probably have good applications for different purposes, but we need to know how they compare and how they operate. I'm sorry, thank you for advancing that. I got it advanced here where I can actually read it. But didn't do it up there, exactly. Yeah, keep track of where I'm supposed to be. The other thing is that technology in this area is developing rapidly, and we believe it will be possible to correlate some of the old physical mechanisms for determining what consumptive use is at the field level by bringing some of this new technology, including computer analysis of satellite imagery, so that we would hope to be able to know with a high degree of certainty what the consumptive use is, what the land use is, what the crop in the field is, so that we can get a better handle on all of that to better manage agriculture, to better manage water rights, and to better manage water in the system, whether it's for salinity management, for export control, what have you. So we're getting a better handle on all of that. We're dealing with it in the context, certainly in 2015. It's a 2-year study. The first year of the study was in the teeth of a terrible drought, and it's nice to have a little bit of respite from that. We'll get different information in 2016 than we could have gotten in 2015, and being able to correlate the two will be valuable. We always try and focus, however, or remember that consumptive use is only one leg of the stool. We've also got to look at diversion within the Delta. That's how we manage water rights. Water rights are determined and administered by diversion, but how the water, after it's diverted, is consumptively used. And then the third leg of the stool, how much of it is returned to the system. There are places in the Delta that actually return more water to the system than they divert, because they're farming below the water table and they're having to drain more than they're actually using. So we're trying to get a handle on that. This is one leg of the stool. It's the one we're starting on first, so that we get better operational data. So we actually, in fact, I may be somewhat responsible for Eric's lateness, because I took 3 hours of his time this morning to sit through an update of this study that we had in Sacramento this morning. The project is now fully funded. The seed money came from the State Water Control Board, funded $200,000 contract with the Center for Watershed Science at UC Davis, and advanced the funding for another $400,000 for the second phase of that. In addition, and by the way, we're very grateful for the Commission's support of this second phase, because some of the money that the State Water Board advanced is internal borrowing, so you're helping us to pay some of that back. We appreciate it. We've deployed, thanks to the support of the Delta water agencies, 5 new SIMA stations in the Delta, so that we get better spatial differentiation, so that we have a better sense for weather and the effects of winds and open channels and so forth on consumptive use. We've also, as part of the study, the Department of Water Resources participation in the study was, they're involved in lots of aspects of it, but they funded the Delta land use survey that was done by a third-party contractor, Land IQ, which has given us a great deal of very granular information that can be updated regularly, so that we have a much better handle on land use and crop use, as well as natural uses in the Delta outside of the cropped land. So, for instance, a better sense for how much fresh water is taken out of the system by water hyacinth, or by riparian habitat, and by evaporation from open channels. So that's a big improvement. We're taking all the data that is developed here, subjecting it to significant QA/QC processes, so that we're trying to raise the level of confidence in all the data that we're looking at, so that we can have greater confidence in the decisions that we make based on that data. The final report of this study will be a peer-reviewed report that will be published in scientific journal, and that report should be available about a year from now. And we're hopeful that, because of a large number of people who are involved in the study, that it'll have, and because it'll be a quality study, that it'll have a lot of credibility, so that we can, as I say, get beyond arguing about what the facts are and use the facts to inform policy. So again, thank you to all the sponsors who have helped to pay for this, and I include in boldface there the Delta Protection Commission. So that's what I have to say about the consumptive use study. I've got quick points to make on other things, but should I stop there, and anybody have questions about the study, or where we are, or what we should be doing next?
Any questions? Sounds like, go ahead and keep going.
Okay. So the diversion reduction program, we issued a report last Friday. There's a link to it at the bottom of this slide. But basically, this was a voluntary program. it bubbled up from the farmers in the Delta, particularly the South and Central Delta, who don't have the advantage that the North Delta has of the water supply contract. So the concern as we went into the fourth year of a drought, the beginning of 2015, was that there would be insufficient water to provide the water to finish crops. And so farmers came forward and suggested a voluntary program in which they would reduce their diversions from the surface water supply by 25% over the course of 4 months, the growing season, June, July, August, September. In exchange for that, ultimately, we agreed in the Delta Watermaster with the Division of Water Rights of the State Water Board that if there was a basis for more severe curtailments of riparian rights later during the season, we would exercise our enforcement discretion to not enforce against anybody who participated in the program. As a result of that arrangement, we got 217 plans covering roughly 2/3 of the Central and South Delta, about 180,000 total acres. So it's 2/3. Why didn't we get 100%? On the one hand, it was only among riparians, so there are certain people who couldn't qualify, and there are others who decided to take their chances. But overall, the program was a success and ended up, as we report, the plan participants, 217 participants, over 180,000 acres, collectively saved about 32%, or reduced their diversions by about 32% versus base year 2013. So there some success. We reduced a little bit the pressure on the overall water system, but I think even more important than that, there was a demonstration here of Delta coming together without litigation, without regulation, to figure out a way to solve a common problem. And we did it flexibly so that at the field level, farmers could decide how they were going to hit the target. And not only did they hit it, but they overachieved. So that's what I have to say about that. Salinity hotspots. This has been a problem for a very long time. There are areas in the South Delta where salinity is a problem. And there's particularly one monitoring spot, the point at which Tracy Boulevard crosses over Old River, where we've had chronic problems. In fact, the projects reported 6 different, what they call exceedances, which are situations where they've been unable to meet the water quality objective in Decision 1642. So we decided that we needed to look at and take apart that problem. The Department of Water Resources also authorized a new study. There have been a lot of studies of this problem. They authorized, or they contracted for a new study, which was just delivered a month or so ago. And that both explains and helps to pull out some data about why this particular spot is a hot spot, and maybe more importantly, suggests a number of potential ways of dealing with that hot spot so that we can avoid future exceedances or violations of the standard in D 1641. And I also want to put that in context because obviously D 1641, the conditions under which the projects operate, are being looked at and revised in light of what we've learned over time, but particularly in the extreme circumstances that we ran into or that we have dealt with in terms of this long and extended drought. So I'm pleased to say that we've got a collaborative process that's involving the South Delta Water Agency, it's involving DWR, it's involving some external experts as well as the State Water Board. So there's not an answer yet, but there's a collaborative process that's trying to get at that answer, and we're pleased with progress so far. The measurement regulation, as of last June, the governor signed into law SB 88, which basically says that all diversions in the state that are over 10 acre-feet per year now must measure their diversions. So basically, there are two ways of doing that. We set up the legislation was silent about how to determine the measurement. So the state board adopted regulations under the emergency authority on January 19th to set out how that measurement should be accomplished. And basically that regulation says not how you should do it, but what your standard should be. It's a how accurate it should be. And there are basically two ways to get that level of accuracy. One is with what's called in the regulation a measuring device, possibly a meter, a staff gauge with a weir, something like that. But in any case, a device that would allow you to measure and keep a record and then periodically report on the rate and volume of your diversion. If for a variety of reasons, and this is more true in the Delta than it is in most upland farming areas, a measuring device will be difficult or too expensive or not accurate enough, any number of issues that you might run into. The second way to comply is what's called a measurement method, and it is what it sounds like. You figure out another method to measure it, and it might be, for instance, creating correlations. So if you know, for instance, consumptive use, you might be able to correlate back to a level of accuracy through a method to know what your diversions are. We recognize that there will be circumstances where neither a measuring device nor a measurement method works in unique circumstances. So there is an off-ramp for something called an alternative compliance plan. It's not a get-out-of-jail-free card. It does require doing the best you can and doing better over time. So we're now in the process of kind of outreach to implement that regulation, and we're involved with lots of meetings with lots of folks throughout the Delta to get that accomplished. Meanwhile, of course, last summer in the teeth of the drought, there were notices sent by the state board of unavailability of water at certain priorities, and as a result of those, there were some circumstances where the water board believes that there were violations of those notices such that people took water out of their priority. And there are a couple of enforcement actions that are ongoing right now. In fact, we start hearings because the staff sends out those notices of unavailability of water at certain priorities, and then if they believe there are violations, they send out either a cease and desist order or administrative civil liability. When those go out, the recipient generally requests the state board to hold a hearing, and those hearings in 2 instances are starting next week for West Side Irrigation District and Byron Bethany Irrigation District. And those have been, enforcement actions have been split into 2 parts, but the first part has been consolidated because the first part is to inquire into the accuracy of the water availability determination. And I would like to think that if these hearings are successful, we'll get a lot of enlightenment about issues that have been in controversy for some time. How to administer the so-called Delta pool. How good is the information on which we at the state board based our supply-demand curves, and what are the impacts of that? We're also going to get at some issues about authority and jurisdiction and so forth. So watch this space. We'll be talking about that, I'm sure, going forward. Also, as probably everybody in the room is aware, there was a case that was brought by the Modesto Irrigation District against an in-delta riparian water user, and that case was the subject of a tentative decision issued by the Superior Court in Sacramento County a couple of weeks ago. There was a hearing of objections on that tentative decision last Friday, and a final decision is likely to come out shortly. That case, to the extent that it becomes final, will provide some guidance for the Delta Watermaster and for the Division of Water Rights about the administration of rights, not only of that specific parcel, the specific defendant in that case, but the application of that point of law. Now, there's so much at stake here. We certainly anticipate that regardless of when and how the case becomes a final decision, we will certainly have an appeal. So we'll have to figure out how to administer under that rule of law once it becomes final, but potentially subject to appeal. Whether there's a stay of the lower court decision pending the appeal will have an impact on that. So that's kind of where we are in enforcement. And finally, I want to just quickly talk about some of the drought lessons. Obviously, our challenge now is to consolidate in this year when hopefully we've got a bit of a respite, consolidate some of what we learned and some of what we recognize we're unable to adequately administer. So we're grateful for the respite, but we're now going to test some of those policies, and I described one test in the Tanaka decision. Another test will come in the West Side Irrigation and BBID case that's before the state board. But I'm trying to consolidate and implement some of the difficulties we ran into in terms of administering water rights in an extreme shortage situation. And that's really when you test the way the system works, because the system is designed as a priority system or a correlative system where it gets tested when there's not enough water for everybody. When there's plenty of water for everybody, everybody's got water rights and nobody's in contest. But when it gets dry, that's when the administration of water rights becomes critical. And so we're looking at all of this in the context of some of the things that are listed on this on this sheet, and trying to make sure that just because it's rained and just because we've had a miracle March and we've got full reservoirs and so forth, or will hopefully have them soon, we don't forget the lessons that we've learned, and we consolidate what we've learned and clarify what we need to, because one thing we know is that there's another drought around the corner, whether it's next year or the year after that, or hopefully a decade from now. It's going to be, it will test us again, and if we fail that test, it'll be in part because we've failed to consolidate the information. So that's a lot of what we're working on, and that's really the end of my report. And happy to answer questions or leave you to your next item on the agenda, which I know is Paul.
You have a speaker.
Great. Thank you, Mr. George. Are there any questions or comments by the commission?
I've got
Melina.
Why am I not surprised, Dante, that you have a question?
I was just wondering whether or not the state board has any interest in requiring the projects to demonstrate how they intend to meet water quality standards in the future. As you know, and I think you've heard me griping about it, you're going to hear more about it as we go into hearings, but in 2013, knowing that there was a difficulty in meeting the cold water requirements for fish, there was a suggestion that came out from the department and the Bureau and the fishery agencies that they relax Delta water quality standards that protect agriculture, and did not mention a word about reducing the exports that would have done the same thing. And they were allowed to drain these reservoirs, and so we've been fighting about shortages ever since. But there needs to be, in my view, and I'm not sure you're the one, and I don't know whether you get jurisdiction over the project that they pump from the Delta, but there needs to be a plan as to how to operate in meeting the standards more than 1 year ahead.
So
That's really a deficiency, I think, in the administration of the whole program.
So your question is, does the state
Are
board
you
have any
doing-
interest, and are we doing
You gonna
anything?
be working on that? Is that
Yes.
within your bailiwick?
Not only are we working on it, but I will tell you that there is a recognition, not only within the water board, but within the projects, that the credibility of the regulations and the conditions on permits are critical to everybody. So it's not just a question of the state board enforcing with the projects the conditions that are in D 1641, or the fish agencies insisting on compliance with the biological opinions and so forth. But it is also the project's recognition that their credibility is importantly at stake, and their need to meet their water quality obligations, et cetera. Now, we are working on that, and it was absolutely tested in the drought, and we learned a lot, and hopefully we're consolidating some of that. But I will also say that it's in a broader context as well, of the state board updating the Delta Water Quality Control Plan, and there are several phases to that, and those phases are about to start. There's a phase 1 report of the Delta Water Quality Control Plan update that is within a few months of being published. So we'll have a lot more to chew on with respect to not only the conditions in the project's water rights, but more broadly, the water quality control in the Delta for all beneficial uses.
Okay, well, that sounds good, but the demonstration that occurs is not very good. You know, State Board is combining a rushed hearing on changes of point of diversion with the Water Quality Control Plan, a disaster procedurally, in my view, and an inappropriate course for the board to take. But more importantly, now that we have reservoirs, a couple of them that have some water, it's important to know that the projects are trying to set up a plan where they will comply with the water quality standards, regardless of what they are. They're presently there. And instead of issuing temporary urgency changes and attacking our water rights in the Delta, there needs to be some fair administration of this thing.
And
Anyway,
I've heard you
Just
make that
blaming
point
you
to
for
the state
everything,
board.
But you're here, and therefore, you should be encouraged to go ahead and help get the state board headed in the right direction.
Thank you, I feel encouraged.
Commissioner Frazier.
Thank you. And you had mentioned in one of your PowerPoint presentations about the salinity hotspots. Would you be able to provide any information on the 3-mile slough monitors that had been hitting that mark consistently up to a certain point? Are they not designated a hotspot, or has that significantly changed?
They're not nearly as chronic and complex a problem as the one we're looking at in the South Delta. I said there were 6 reports of exceedances at the one point in the South Delta. There were also, Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there were 4 other reports, total of 10 in 2015, where there were exceedances. Exceedances is a euphemism, and with all due respect, an exceedance means you missed the condition. That's otherwise known as a violation of the condition. So we take it seriously, and the projects take it seriously. The state board has issued a cease and desist order for some of those violations, and there are procedures in those cease and desist orders that the projects are required to and do report, make improvements, et cetera. So there's a whole suite of regulatory responses And I have to say that generally the projects take it seriously, and they work hard to inform us. They often tell us that the conditions are inappropriate for one reason or another. So we do have some of those arguments, and there are some arguments even in 2015 about situations where there was an exceedance of the relaxed standard under the temporary agency change petition. I would say that everybody from the project operators to the State Water Board to the Delta Stewardship Council and certainly to the Central and South Delta water agencies that are focused on this, and there's none of this that's swept under the rug. It's being dealt with in real time.
So when the exceedance happens, is the agricultural industry acknowledged and notified that they should be limiting their diversions might harm their crops or going forward? I mean, are they notified that they might be in peril on their crops if the salinity is so high that it's not germane to good quality water?
I probably ought to let Paul describe what the notifications are. Clearly, there are processes that the division or the Department of Water Resources has set up to compensate, particularly in the North Delta, any farmers who are injured by heightened salinity or reduced water levels or reduced flow. I don't think that there is a specific mechanism to warn them. Oftentimes, it's difficult to know in real time what's going on. You often find out, you figure out after the fact. Although I will say that in the 10 instances of exceedances that are reported to us by the projects as they're required to do under their various orders, they're not gross exceedances. And we don't have a similar suite of complaints, people saying they missed their target and it hurt us. There may be some instances where that in fact happens, and as I say, the Department of Water Resources has set up a compensation mechanism where number one, the damage has occurred, and number two, there's a way to demonstrate causality.
Commissioner Loftus?
I just have a question back on the consumptive use. You're going to change the land use survey from trucks to satellites,
Right.
like NASA satellites?
Yes, Landsat satellites. So,
Instead of drones?
well, we're going to get to drones too, but the benefit of the Landsat satellites, if you can get sufficient resolution, and then if you can improve your computerized mechanisms for analyzing that data, it becomes really powerful. And I'll give you an example. In 2015, Land IQ developed a Delta-wide land use survey. The last time it was done by DWR in 2007 in what they call windshield survey. And that means they drive around and they look and see what's there, and they map it.
That's the trucks.
Trucks, exactly. That's the windshield survey. They drive those trucks around, and smart people who can identify the crop, identify them, they map them really carefully, and you've got a composite snapshot of land uses, primarily agricultural land uses, in the Delta in 2007. So land uses change, crops get rotated, things happen. So how often can you do that? It's very labor intensive, it's very expensive, and it gives you a one-time shot. Instead, what we did this year, with the cooperation and involvement of the Department of Water Resources, was to engage Land IQ, a company that analyzes the satellite data. The Landsat satellite passes over this area, I think, once every 16 days. So you've got a series of views. So the key is to get that down to a granular level where you can tell on a field-by-field basis what's the crop with a 95% accuracy. That's a higher level of accuracy than with a windshield survey. But the thing is, once you do it, as Land IQ has just done for 2015, now you've got two opportunities. One is going forward, all you have to do is look what's different. And so you don't have to go do a whole different survey. You lay one on top of the other and you say what's different, and you focus your attention there. So the updates are much easier. In addition, you can go back and you can see what has developed. That's particularly important where you're talking about permanent crops. So you can tell when the orchard was planted, because it takes a different amount of water when it's in third leaf than when it's 10 years into production. So there's much more that you can do once you figure out how to read the Landsat image with a high level of accuracy, so that you can then determine what is the consumptive use, not just on a seasonal basis, but you can get much more acuity. What is it in June compared to July when there's more leaf on the plant and so forth? So that's why we went from windshields to satellites.
Good start. All right, great. Are there any other questions, comments?
I got a comment.
Yes, sir.
If you're interested in it, the USDA is using the satellite technology to monitor cropping annually. So that if you look up USDA cropscape, you will find an image of the United States. You can outline the polygon you want to look at and hit the right bar at the top, and it'll give you all the crops and acreage. Now, the accuracy of that, as I understood from today's meeting, is not as high as this project, but it is really a tool that shows you what can be done if this process turns out.
And there are a lot of circumstances where the level of accuracy that the USDA product gives is fine. It's enough. But when things get really tight and you're talking about a unique area, small area, not the entire continental United States, and not commodity crops, because we've got much more specialty crops here, you really need that higher level of acuity.
All right. Okay, we do have one slip to speak on this item. Melinda Terry? Come up, Linda.
I'm going to have a question for you, but first, in response to Assemblyman Frazier, I did look up. I didn't see at any of the meetings where they had mentioned the exceedance of 3 Mile Slough. I looked up to see if the department had notified, because really under the TUCPs they're supposed to. Didn't find any for 3 Mile Slough. There were other notifications, but all of them that I looked at tend to be 30 days after they've exceeded, and so they'll tell them 30 days, for the last 30 days, we were. So I didn't see any on that. And as I recall, last year when you asked that question of the water board member, Didi Adamo, she seemed a little unaware even that the exceedance of the relaxed D1641 at 3 Mile Slough was occurring. So my question for you was, I don't have any experience in going to these water rights hearings, but it just came to my attention recently that there's a statute that says that the state water board resources, when they have orders that come out, that they can be precedent setting. And then I had also heard that in these hearings that are starting Monday on Byron, Bethany, and is it Woodbridge? Westside. That Metropolitan Water District, in part of their evidence, is submitting evidence about availability of water in the Delta. And, I'm a little concerned because if the board, in fact, is going to make some kind of determination about availability for the entire Delta and really didn't notice the rest, my agency might have filed and become a party or something, but we honestly thought this was very limited to these two agencies' water rights, but this sounds like a much bigger decision, and is that true? Because again, I just heard this, you know, I had to immediately contact my attorney because the hearing starts on Monday, and, you know, so we need to know if that is in fact true, if you could let me know.
So Melinda, is that all your questions so that we can? Yep, okay, good, thank you.
So first of all, you're right that an adjudicated determination by the state board is a precedent, like a court case is. So they're
That it can apply to other people?
well, the principle is a precedent that can be cited in other similar circumstances. So the law is the same for everybody. The facts are often different. So the state board will determine what the law is with respect to these alleged unlawful diversions. And it is entirely possible that the law that is developed through that process and through the inevitable appeal to the courts would be applied elsewhere. And certainly, I think my hope, and I think the hope of the Water Board, is that these two instances allow us, with specific facts, to get at some of the contested legal issues, and they are contested. You're right, the Metropolitan Water District and more broadly the State Water Project contractors, as you probably all know, filed a complaint alleging a variety of illegal diversions in the Delta and proposed a basis for enforcing against them. That complaint is pending. There is no process that's yet been determined on how we are going to deal with that complaint, because it's a tough issue. And in the West Side and Byron Bethany hearing, those same parties have come forward and proposed something like what they have in their complaint.
I guess I would just voice that the concern here is whether the notice and everything that's gone up until now has been really clear to everyone else that this, in fact, could end up in decisions that set precedents, and we didn't get to be party to it. That's very concerning, so.
Okay, are there any other questions or comments? If not, Mr. George, thank you very much, and you're absolutely right. This respite certainly will allow some of the more contested issues to sort of work their way through, so that the next opportunity will have some clarity on some of these more difficult issues. All right, great. All right, thank you very much. All right, next items, let's see, what do we got here? Item 8, is drought update.